My name is Renzo Battaglia, and I'm a plumber from Detroit who survived the first 90 days when the world froze over. 3 months ago, I was fixing water heaters and unclogging drains. Now I'm using those same skills to keep people alive in an ice age that turned my city into a frozen wasteland. I've seen neighbors freeze to death, fought other survivors for resources, and discovered that knowing every pipe and tunnel in Detroit might be the only reason I'm still breathing. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Renzo Battaglia, and I'm a plumber from Detroit who survived the first 90 days when the world froze over. 3 months ago, I was fixing water heaters and unclogging drains. Now I'm using those same skills to keep people alive in an ice age that turned my city into a frozen wasteland. I've seen neighbors freeze to death, fought other survivors for resources, and discovered that knowing every pipe and tunnel in Detroit might be the only reason I'm still breathing. Let me tell you how it all started. It was a Tuesday morning in early May when I got the call about Mrs. Chun's water heater. Nothing unusual about that. I'd been working as a plumber for 20 years, specializing in the big municipal systems that keep cities running. My grandfather helped build Detroit's infrastructure back in the 40s, and I guess you could say I inherited his understanding of how water moves through a city. I always carried my tools with me, kept my multi-tool on my belt, and had this habit of checking my equipment twice before starting any job. Those habits kept me alive in tight spaces, and they were about to keep me alive in ways I never imagined. Mrs. Chun lived in one of those old brick houses in Corktown, the kind with basements that connected to the original utility tunnels from when Detroit was expanding. I remember thinking about my daughters that morning, Emma and Sophia, my 12-year-old twins who were staying with their mother in Ann Arbor. The divorce had been finalized 6 months earlier, and I was still adjusting to the custody schedule. I'd planned to pick them up that weekend, maybe take them to see the Tigers play. That was before the world ended. I was down in Mrs. Chun's basement, working on her old gas water heater, when my phone started buzzing, emergency alerts. At first, I ignored them. You get used to amber alerts and weather warnings when you work in infrastructure. But they kept coming, one after another, each one more urgent than the last. I pulled out my phone and saw the words that changed everything. Yellowstone National Park experiencing catastrophic volcanic eruption. Immediate evacuation of surrounding areas ordered. I'd heard about Yellowstone before. Every plumber who worked with geothermal systems knew about the supervolcano sitting under Wyoming. But it was one of those things you filed away in the back of your mind, like a massive earthquake or a meteor strike. Something that could happen, but probably wouldn't. In your lifetime, I was wrong. The news reports started coming in while I was still in that basement. The first footage showed this massive column of ash rising into the sky, bigger than any mountain I'd ever seen. The reporters were using words like unprecedented and catastrophic, but I don't think any of us really understood what it meant. Not yet. The ash cloud was spreading across Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas. Weather stations were reporting visibility dropping to 0 across hundreds of miles. I finished Mrs. Chun's water heater and climbed back up to street level. That's when I saw it. The sky was wrong. It was noon, but it looked like dusk. This gray, heavy darkness was moving in from the west, and you could smell it in the air. Sulfur and dust and something else, something that made your throat burn. I'd worked in enough basements and sewers to know what dangerous air smelled like, and this was it. Mrs. Chun came out to pay me, and I could see the worry in her eyes. She'd been watching the news too. She asked me what I thought was going to happen, and I told her what I tell everyone when they ask about plumbing problems. We'll figure it out one step at a time. But I was already thinking about those tunnels under her house, about the network of passages that ran under half of Detroit. I'd been down there plenty of times for repairs, and I knew things about the city's underground that most people didn't. I had a feeling that knowledge might come. In handy, the temperature dropped 5 degrees that first day. I remember checking the thermometer on my truck when I got home, thinking it had to be broken. May in Detroit should have been warm, maybe even hot. Instead, it felt like late October. The Weather Service was calling it a temporary atmospheric disturbance, but I could see the ash settling on everything. Cars, buildings, trees, all of it covered in this fine gray dust that got into your lungs and made you cough. By the second day, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees. The ash cloud had reached us fully, and the sun was just a dim orange disk behind. All that gray. I tried calling Emma and Sophia, but the phone lines were jammed. Everyone was trying to reach someone, and the cell towers couldn't handle the load. I left messages, telling them I loved them and that I'd drive down to Ann Arbor as soon as the roads cleared up. The roads never cleared up. By the third day, it was snowing. Not the light, pretty snow you might see in a late spring cold snap, but heavy, wet snow that stuck to everything and kept falling. The power company was sending out crews to deal with downed lines, but they couldn't keep up. Ice was forming on the cables faster than they could clear it. I spent that week winterizing my house like it was November instead of May. I'd learned a lot about cold weather systems from working on heating and cooling installations, and I knew my old house wouldn't hold up to a real freeze without some help. I wrapped the pipes, sealed the windows, and moved my tools down to the basement where they'd be easier to reach. I also started checking my food supplies, not because I thought I'd need them, but because that's what you do when you work in emergency services. You prepare for the worst and hope for the best. The worst was coming whether I was ready or not. By the end of that first week, the temperature was dropping every day. 20 degrees below normal. 30 degrees below normal. The city's water treatment plants were struggling to keep up with demand as people cranked up their heat and tried to keep their pipes from freezing. I could see the pressure dropping in the system just by watching how the water came out of my own faucets. 20 years of working with municipal water systems teaches you to read the signs, and all the signs were saying the same thing. This was bigger than anyone wanted to admit. The city started setting up warming centers in schools and community buildings, but they were filling up fast. People were scared, and they had every right to be. The news was showing footage from Wyoming and Montana, entire towns buried under ash and snow. The government was calling it a temporary weather event, but I'd seen enough infrastructure failures to know when a system was breaking down. And the system that keeps civilization running was breaking down fast. I tried to drive to Ann Arbor on the 8th day, but the highways were packed with people trying to get south. Cars were sliding off the road, running out of gas, breaking down in the cold. I made it about 30 miles before I had to turn around. The snow was coming down so hard I couldn't see the road, and my truck was starting to slip even with the chains on. I realized I might be making a mistake trying to leave, but I also realized I might be making a mistake staying. That's when I discovered something that changed everything. I was back in my basement, checking the furnace and making sure the pipes were still flowing, when I noticed something I'd never paid attention to before. There was a gap in the foundation wall, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. I'd seen it before, but never thought much about it. Old houses in Detroit have all kinds of odd connections to the utility tunnels that run under the city. But this gap led to something bigger. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled through. On the other side was a tunnel, maybe 6 feet high and 4 feet wide, running parallel to my street. It was old, probably built when they were installing the original water mains in the 1920s. But it was dry, and it was warmer than the air outside. More importantly, it connected to other tunnels. I could see passages branching off in different directions, and I realized I was looking at a network that probably ran under half of Corktown. I spent 2 hours exploring that first night, mapping out the passages in my head. I found connections. To the storm drains, to the old steam tunnels that used to heat the downtown buildings, even to some of the newer utility corridors. I wasn't the only one who knew about these passages, though. I found signs that other people had been down there. Food wrappers, cigarette butts, even some old sleeping bags. Whoever had been using these tunnels knew what they were doing. The thought bothered me more than it should have. If I could figure out how to use these tunnels to move around the city safely, so could other people. And if those other people were desperate enough, they might not be friendly. I made a mental note to pay more attention to who else might be down there, but I was focused on more immediate problems. By the 10th day, the snow was 3 feet deep and still falling. The power grid was failing in sections across the city. My neighborhood lost electricity for 6 hours, then 12 hours, then it came back on for a few hours before going out again. The water pressure was dropping steadily, and I could hear the pipes in my walls groaning under the stress of trying to keep flowing in sub-zero temperatures. I started rationing my food and water, not because I was running low, but because I could see where this was heading. The supply trucks weren't making it through the snow. The grocery stores were running out of everything. People were starting to panic, and panic makes people do stupid things. I'd seen it before during the big blackout in 2003, and during the water crisis in 2014. When people get scared, they stop thinking clearly. Mrs. Chun knocked on my door on the 12th day. She was worried about her pipes freezing, and she wanted to know if I could help her. I went over and checked her system, and it was worse than I thought. The pipes in her basement were already showing signs of stress, and her water heater was struggling to maintain temperature. I did what I could, but I knew it was just buying time. While I was working, she told me something that made my blood run cold. She'd seen people moving around outside at night, people who didn't live in the neighborhood. They were going through the abandoned houses, looking for supplies. Some of them were armed. She'd called the police, but they weren't responding to calls unless someone was in immediate danger. They had bigger problems to deal with. That night, I started hearing noises from the tunnels under my house. Footsteps, voices, the sound of people moving equipment. I realized that my secret passage wasn't so secret after all. Other people were using the tunnel system, and they were getting organized. I should have paid more attention to who else was down there, but I was still focused on the immediate crisis. The immediate crisis was getting worse by the hour. The temperature hit 10 below zero on the 10th day, and it was still dropping. The snow was so deep that cars were completely buried. The power was out more than it was on. The water pressure was down to a trickle, and I knew the main lines were probably freezing solid. I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of trying to keep my whole house warm, I moved everything I needed into the basement. My tools, my food, my water, my emergency supplies. I set up a small camp near the tunnel entrance where I could stay warm and still have access to the passage system. I also started keeping my multi-tool and my heaviest wrenches within easy reach. If the people in the tunnels turned out to be hostile, I wanted to be ready. The people in the tunnels were about to become the least of my problems. On the 17th day, I woke up to complete silence. No cars on the street, no planes in the sky, no hum of electrical equipment. The power grid had failed completely. And from what I could see through my basement window, it wasn't coming back anytime soon. The ice on the power lines was so thick that the cables were snapping under their own weight. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. The cell towers were either down or blocked by the ash and snow. I was completely cut off from the outside world, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I realized that I might be completely on my own. Emma and Sophia were 40 miles away, and I had no way to reach them or even know if they were safe. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from one of the houses across the street, a sharp, desperate sound that cut through the silence like a knife. I looked out my window and saw Mrs. Patterson from 2 houses down, standing in her front yard in nothing but a nightgown, beating on her neighbor's door. Her house was dark, and I could see ice forming on her windows. Her heating system had failed, and she was going to freeze to death if someone didn't help her. I grabbed my tools and ran outside, the cold hitting me like a physical blow. The air was so cold, it hurt to breathe, and the snow was so deep I had to fight for every step. Mrs. Patterson was already showing signs of hypothermia, her lips blue and her hands shaking uncontrollably. Her neighbor wasn't answering the door, and I had a terrible feeling I knew why. I got Mrs. Patterson back to my house and wrapped her in blankets near my emergency heater. Then I went back to check on her neighbor. The front door was locked, but I knew how to get into most houses in the neighborhood through the basement connections. I went down through my tunnel system and found the passage that led to his house. He was dead, frozen solid in his living room, still sitting in his chair with a blanket wrapped around him. The house was like a tomb, so cold that my breath was visible in the air. His heating system had failed, and he died sometime during the night. He wouldn't be the last. Over. The next 2 days, I found 4 more bodies in the houses around me. People who'd run out of heating fuel, people whose systems had failed, people who'd simply given up when the cold became too much. The city services weren't responding to calls anymore. The police, the fire department, the ambulances, they were all dealing with their own emergencies. We were on our own. Mrs. Chun came to my house on the 18th day, bringing 2 other neighbors with her. Mr. Rodriguez from the corner house and Sarah Williams from the apartment building at the end of the block. They'd figured out that I was the only one in the neighborhood who still had heat and running water, and they wanted to know if I could help them. I looked at their faces, saw the fear and desperation there, and realized that my choice wasn't really a choice at all. I could try to survive alone, hoarding my resources and my knowledge, and probably die when the supplies ran out or the hostile survivors found me. Or I could try to help these people, share what I knew, and maybe we could all make it through this together. It wasn't really a choice, but it was the most important decision I'd made in my life. That's when I started explaining to them what I knew about the tunnel system, about the city's infrastructure, about the water and heating systems we'd need to survive. I told them about the passages under our houses, about the connections between the buildings, about the supplies we'd need to gather, and the defenses we'd need to set up. I also told them about the other people I'd been hearing in the tunnels, the ones who might not be friendly. By the end of the 18th day, we had a plan. We'd fortify my house as a base of operations, use the tunnel system to move between buildings safely, and start gathering supplies from the abandoned houses around us. We'd work together to maintain heat and water, and we'd defend each other against anyone who tried to take what we'd built. It was a good plan, but plans have a way of falling apart when you're dealing with desperate people in desperate times. The other survivors in the tunnel system were getting organized too, and they had their own plans. Plans that didn't include sharing resources with anyone else. I thought having a plan would make things easier, but I was wrong. The 19th day taught me that survival wasn't just about staying warm and finding food. It was about learning an entirely new set of rules that nobody had written down and everybody was making up as they went along. The world I'd known for 38 years was gone, and the world that replaced it was brutal and unforgiving. The first thing I had to teach my new group was how to move through the tunnel system safely. Mrs. Chun, Mr. Rodriguez, and Sarah had never been down in the utility passages before, and they were terrified. The tunnels were dark, cramped, and filled with the sound of settling ice and groaning pipes. But they were also our lifeline, the only way to move between buildings without exposing ourselves to the deadly cold above ground. I led them through the passage that connected my basement to Mrs. Chun's house, showing them how to navigate by feel and sound. The tunnel was maybe 50 feet long, but it felt like a mile when you were crawling through it for the first time. Sarah was claustrophobic, and she kept stopping to catch her breath. Mr. Rodriguez was 73 years old, and every movement was an effort for him. Mrs. Chun was tough, but she was also smart enough to be scared. While we were down there, I showed them something that had been bothering me since I first discovered the tunnels. There were markings on the walls, symbols scratched into the concrete that I didn't recognize. They looked deliberate, like someone was leaving messages for other people. The symbols were fresh, made within the last few days, and they were appearing in new locations every time I checked. Someone else was using these tunnels regularly, and they were organized enough to have their own communication system. I told my group that we needed to be careful, that we weren't the only ones who knew about the passages. Mrs. Chen asked me what I thought the symbols meant, and I told her the truth. I had no idea, but I knew they meant other people were down here, and I didn't know if those people were friendly or hostile. I made everyone promise to stay together when we were in the tunnels and to never go down there alone. The next challenge was water. The city's water pressure had dropped to almost nothing, and what little water was still flowing was contaminated with ash and debris from the broken mains. I knew how to purify water using basic filtration and boiling, but we needed a reliable source. That meant tapping into the main lines directly, which meant going deeper into the tunnel system than I'd ever been before. I took Mr. Rodriguez with me on the first water run, leaving Mrs. Chun and Sarah to watch the house. The main water line for our neighborhood ran through a service tunnel about 200 feet from my basement. It was a tight squeeze getting there, and the tunnel was partially flooded with ice-cold water from a burst pipe somewhere upstream. But the main line was still intact, and I was able to tap into it using tools from my truck. While I was working on the water connection, Mr. Rodriguez kept watch. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he knew how to stay alert in dangerous situations. That's probably why he noticed the sounds before I did. Footsteps in the tunnel system, coming from the direction of downtown. Multiple people, moving quietly, but not quietly enough. They were maybe 100 feet away, and they were heading in our direction. I quickly finished the water connection, and we got out of there, but not before I heard voices. They were speaking in whispers, but I caught enough to know they were talking about buildings, about which ones had supplies and which ones were occupied. They were scouting, and they were getting close to our neighborhood. I realized that the symbols on the walls weren't random. They were marking territory, and we were about to find out who was doing the marking. Back at the house, I told Mrs. Chen and Sarah what we'd heard. We needed to start thinking about defense, about how to protect ourselves if the people in the tunnels turned out to be hostile. I showed them how to barricade the tunnel entrances, how to create choke points that would slow down intruders, and how to set up early warning systems using tripwires and noisemakers. The 20th day brought our first real test. I was working on a heating system in Sarah's apartment building when I heard the alarm we'd set up in the tunnel. Someone was trying to get through the barricade at the main entrance. I grabbed my tools and headed down to investigate, telling the others to stay upstairs and be ready to run if things went bad. There were 3 of them, all men, all armed, with makeshift weapons. They'd cut through our barricade and were exploring the tunnel system, mapping it out just like I had been doing. When they saw me, they stopped and we stared at each other for a long moment. The leader was a big guy, maybe 40 years old, with a beard and the kind of build that comes from hard physical labor. He looked like he could handle himself in a fight. He told me his name was Marcus, and he represented a group of survivors who were organizing the tunnel system. They were claiming territory, establishing safe zones, and setting up a trade network for supplies. It sounded reasonable, even helpful, until he explained the terms. Anyone who wanted to use the tunnels would have to pay a tax. Food, water, medical supplies, tools, anything of value. In exchange, they'd provide protection and access to the larger network. I asked him what would happen if we didn't want to join his organization. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. He said that the tunnels were dangerous, that accidents happened to people who weren't part of the network. Pipes burst, passages collapsed, people got lost in the dark. It would be a shame if something like that happened to us. I've dealt with bullies before, both in the construction business and in my personal life. I knew what Marcus was really saying. Pay us or we'll make your life miserable. Maybe we'll even kill you if you cause too much trouble. It was protection racket, plain and simple, and I wasn't about to let anyone shake down my group. I told Marcus that we'd think about it, that we'd give him an answer in a day or two. He seemed satisfied with that, and he left with his 2 companions. But I knew he'd be back, and I knew that when he came back, he'd expect us to cave into his demands. That's when I started working on what I called my backup plan. Every system needs redundancy. That's one of the first things you learn when you're working with critical infrastructure. If the main system fails, you need a secondary system to take over. If the secondary system fails, you need a third option. I'd been thinking about the tunnel system as our primary survival tool, but I realized we needed other options. I spent the 21st day exploring the areas around our neighborhood that I hadn't checked yet. The storm drains, the old steam tunnels, the service corridors that connected to the electrical grid. I found passages that Marcus and his group didn't know about, routes that could get us to other parts of the city without using the main tunnel network. More importantly, I found something that could change the balance of power in our favor. The main water pumping station for our section of Detroit was located about half a mile from my house. It was a concrete building, built like a bunker, with backup generators and emergency supplies. The building was abandoned, but the equipment was still functional. If I could get the pumps working again, I could restore water pressure to the entire neighborhood. That would make us valuable to everyone, including Marcus and his group. But it would also make us a target. Control of the water supply meant control of the neighborhood, and I wasn't sure we were ready for that kind of responsibility. I decided to keep the pumping station to myself for now, but I made sure I knew exactly how to get there and how to get the equipment running when the time came. The 22nd day brought bad news. Sarah had been checking on the other buildings in our area, and she'd found more bodies. The cold was killing people faster than we'd expected. Entire families were dying in their homes, freezing to death when their heating systems failed. The city's emergency services had completely collapsed, and there was nobody coming to help. We started doing welfare checks on the surviving neighbors, bringing them food and medical supplies when we could. It was dangerous work, because every trip outside exposed us to the cold and to the other survivor groups that were operating in the area. But we couldn't just let people die when we had the resources to help them. That's when I realized we were becoming valuable to the community, in ways I hadn't expected. My knowledge of the infrastructure was useful, but Mrs. Chun's medical training was even more important. She'd been a nurse before she retired, and she was the only person in the neighborhood who knew how to treat hypothermia and frostbite. Mr. Rodriguez knew about security and defense from his military background. Sarah was good with people, and she was becoming our diplomat and negotiator. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were becoming leaders, and that meant we were becoming targets. Marcus and his group weren't the only ones who'd noticed what we were doing. Other survivor groups were watching us too, and they were making their own plans for how to deal with us. The 23rd day brought our first real confrontation. I was working on a burst pipe in the tunnel system when I heard shouting from the direction of my house. I dropped my tools and ran, using the passages to get back as quickly as possible. When I got there, I found Mrs. Chun and Sarah standing in the kitchen, facing off against 2 women who'd forced their way into the house. The women were desperate, half-frozen, and armed with kitchen knives. They demanded food and medical supplies, threatening to hurt Mrs. Chun if we didn't give them what they wanted. They'd been watching us for days, they said, and they knew we had more resources than we needed. They wanted their fair share, and they were willing to fight for it. I came up behind them through the basement entrance, my heavy pipe wrench in my hand. I told them to put down their weapons and leave, that we'd give them some food and medical supplies if they asked nicely. But they were beyond reason, beyond negotiation. Desperation had made them dangerous, and they weren't going to leave without taking what they wanted. The fight was short and brutal. I managed to disarm one of the women, but the other one lunged at Mrs. Chun with her knife. Sarah tackled her, and they both went down hard. The woman hit her head on the kitchen table, and she stopped moving. The other woman saw what happened and ran, leaving her companion behind. We checked on the unconscious woman, and she was still breathing but badly hurt. Mrs. Chun wanted to help her, but I knew it was too dangerous. If we helped her, she'd know where we lived and what resources we had. If we let her go, she'd come back with reinforcements. If we kept her prisoner, we'd have to feed her and guard her, and we didn't have the resources for that. We made a decision that still haunts me. We carried her outside and left her in the snow, unconscious but alive. We told ourselves that someone would find her, that she'd wake up and make it to safety. But the temperature was 20 below zero, and we knew what would happen to someone left outside in that cold. We'd essentially sentenced her to death, and we all knew it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman we'd left in the snow, about the choices we'd made and the choices we'd have to make in the future. I realized that survival wasn't just about staying warm and finding food. It was about becoming someone you never thought you'd become, about making decisions that would have been unthinkable in the old world. The 24th day brought news that changed everything. Mr. Rodriguez had been monitoring the radio frequencies, trying to pick up news from the outside world. He'd found a government emergency broadcast that was still transmitting, and what he heard made us all realize how bad things really were. The ash cloud from Yellowstone had circled the globe, blocking sunlight and dropping temperatures worldwide. The entire northern hemisphere was experiencing the same kind of extreme cold we're dealing with in Detroit. Crop failures were causing famine in most of the world's agricultural regions. Governments were collapsing, and billions of people were either dead or displaced. The broadcast estimated that the extreme cold would last for at least 2 years, maybe longer. There was no immediate help coming, no rescue operations, no return to normal life. We were on our own, and we were going to be on our own for a very long time. That's when I made the decision to tell my group about the water pumping station. If we were going to survive for years instead of months, we needed to think bigger. We needed to control resources, establish trade relationships, and build a sustainable community. The pumping station was our chance to do that, but it was also our chance to paint a target on our backs. I explained my plan to restore water pressure to the neighborhood and the risks that would come with it. Mrs. Chun was worried about making ourselves too visible, about attracting attention from hostile groups. Mr. Rodriguez was concerned about our ability to defend such a valuable resource. Sarah was excited about the possibility of helping more people, but she was also realistic about the dangers. We spent the 25th day planning and preparing. I mapped out the route to the pumping station, identifying the safest passages and the potential choke points where we could be ambushed. Mrs. Chun gathered medical supplies in case someone got hurt during the operation. Mr. Rodriguez worked on weapons and defensive positions. Sarah prepared food and water for what might be a long, dangerous journey. The 26th day was when we discovered that Marcus and his group had been watching us more closely than we'd realized. I was doing a final check of the tunnel route when I found fresh symbols on the walls, symbols that led directly to the pumping station. Someone had been following me, mapping my movements, figuring out what I was planning. When I got back to the house, I found Marcus waiting for me in the kitchen. He was sitting at my table, drinking my coffee, acting like he owned the place. Mrs. Chun, Mr. Rodriguez, and Sarah were sitting across from him, their faces tense with worry. Marcus had brought 6 people with him this time, all armed, all positioned around the house to make sure we couldn't escape. He told me that he knew about my plan to restore the water pumps, and he was impressed by my ambition. But he also made it clear that the pumping station was in his territory, and any operation there would have to be approved by his organization. He was willing to let us proceed, but the terms had changed. We wouldn't just be paying a tax on tunnel access. We'd be working for him, following his orders, giving him control of the water supply. I asked him what would happen if we refused. He looked around the room, at Mrs. Chun and Mr. Rodriguez and Sarah, and his meaning was clear. We could work for him, or we could die. There weren't any other options. That's when I realized that my backup plan was about to become a lot more complicated. The water pumping station wasn't just a resource anymore. It was a battleground, and the winner would control the survival of everyone in the neighborhood. I'd thought I was planning a technical operation, but I was actually planning for war. I told Marcus that we'd need time to think about his offer, that we'd give him an answer in 24 hours. He seemed satisfied with that, and he left with his people. But I knew he'd be watching us, and I knew that when we made our move toward the pumping station, we'd be walking into a trap. The 27th day was spent preparing for what might be our last operation as a free group. I knew that once we made our move, there would be no going back. We'd either succeed and become a major player in the new world, or we'd fail and probably die in the attempt. The choice was ours, but it wasn't really a choice at all. The pumping station was the key to everything. Control of the water supply meant control of the neighborhood, and control of the neighborhood meant survival. I'd spent my entire career working with water systems, and I knew that whoever controlled the flow of water controlled the future. The question was whether we were strong enough to take that control and hold it against everyone who would try to take it away from us. That night, I lay awake thinking about Marcus and his ultimatum. 24 hours to decide whether we'd become his employees or his enemies. But I'd already made my decision the moment he sat down at my kitchen table and acted like he owned the place. Nobody was going to control my fate except me, and nobody was going to threaten the people I'd sworn to protect. The 28th day started with reconnaissance. I needed to know exactly what we were up against before we made our move toward the pumping station. I sent Sarah to check on the other survivor groups in the area to see if any of them might be willing to work. With us against Marcus, Mr. Rodriguez took watch duty. Keeping an eye on the approaches to our house, Mrs. Chun started preparing medical supplies for what was likely to be a dangerous operation. I spent the morning exploring the deeper sections of the tunnel system, areas I'd never been to before. I found passages that connected to the old subway tunnels, routes that led to the industrial district, and most importantly, a service corridor that ran directly under the pumping station. The corridor was flooded with about 2 feet of ice-cold water, but it was passable if you were willing to wade through it. While I was down there, I discovered something that changed my understanding of the situation completely. Marcus wasn't the only one interested in the pumping station. There were other groups operating in the tunnels, groups that were more organized and more dangerous than anything I'd encountered so far. I found equipment caches, communication gear, and weapons stored in hidden alcoves throughout the tunnel system. The symbols on the walls weren't just territorial markings. They were part of a complex communication network that different groups were using to coordinate their activities. Some of the symbols indicated safe passage, others marked dangerous areas, and a few marked locations where supplies were hidden. I was looking at the infrastructure of an underground war, and I was right in the middle of it. Sarah came back with disturbing news. The other survivor groups in the neighborhood were scared of Marcus, but they were also scared of each other. Trust was in short supply, and everyone was focused on protecting their own people. We weren't going to get help from the outside, which meant we were going to have to handle Marcus and his organization ourselves. Mr. Rodriguez had even worse news. He'd spotted armed patrols moving through the area around our house. Marcus wasn't just watching us, he was positioning his people for an assault. The 24-hour deadline wasn't a negotiation tactic. It was the countdown to an attack, and we were running out of time to prepare. I made the decision to accelerate our timeline. We'd make our move toward the pumping station that night, before Marcus could organize his assault. It was risky, but staying put was even riskier. If we could get the water pumps running, we have something valuable to trade with other groups. If we could control the water supply, we have leverage against Marcus and anyone else who wanted to threaten us. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. We'd use the flooded service corridor to reach the pumping station, avoiding the main tunnel routes that Marcus was watching. Once we got there, I'd work on getting the pumps operational while the others kept watch. If everything went according to plan, we'd have water pressure restored to the neighborhood by morning. But I'd learned that plans rarely survive contact with reality, especially when other people are trying to kill you. I made sure everyone understood that this was a one-way trip. Once we left the house, we couldn't come back until we'd either succeeded or failed completely. There was no middle ground, no room for compromise. We left the house at 10 o'clock that night, using the basement entrance to access the tunnel system. The temperature outside was 30 below zero, and the tunnels were only slightly warmer. We moved slowly through the passages, checking for Marcus's people at every intersection. The symbols on the walls seemed to be watching us, marking our progress for anyone who knew how to read them. The flooded service corridor was worse than I'd expected. The water was deeper than I'd thought, and it was flowing fast enough to knock you off your feet if you weren't careful. The current was carrying chunks of ice that could break your leg if they hit you wrong. Mrs. Chun had trouble keeping up, and Sarah was struggling with the cold water. But we made it through, and we reached the pumping station without being detected. The building was exactly as I'd left it, dark and apparently abandoned. But I could see fresh footprints in the snow around the entrance, and I knew we weren't the first people to discover this place. I sent Mr. Rodriguez to check the perimeter while I worked on getting inside. The main door was locked, but I knew how to get into most industrial buildings through the service entrances. Inside, the pumping station was a maze of pipes, valves, and electrical equipment. The backup generators were still functional, and there was enough fuel to run them for several days. The main pumps were in good condition, but they'd been shut down when the power grid failed. Getting them running again would require bypassing the safety systems and manually starting the diesel engines. I'd worked on similar systems before, but never under these conditions. The building was freezing cold, and my hands were numb within minutes of starting work. The equipment was covered with ice, and some of the pipes had burst from the freeze. I had to thaw out the control systems, using a propane torch, and every move had to be precise because one mistake could disable the entire system. While I was working, Mrs. Chun and Sarah kept watch from the control room windows. They could see the approaches to the building, and they were responsible for giving me warning. If Marcus's people showed up, Mr. Rodriguez was outside, using his military training to set up defensive positions around the building. It took me 3 hours to get the first pump running, and another hour to bring the second one online. The sound of the diesel engines was incredibly loud in the quiet night, and I knew it would attract attention from every survivor group in the area. But I also knew that the sound meant we were succeeding, that we were about to change the balance of power in our favor. The water pressure gauges started climbing as the pumps pushed water through the distribution system. I could see the pressure building throughout the neighborhood, and I knew that people were about to have running water for the first time in weeks. It was a moment of triumph, but it was also the moment when our real problems began. Sarah spotted the first group of armed men approaching from the north. They were moving carefully, using the abandoned buildings for cover. but they were definitely heading for the pumping station. A few minutes later, Mrs. Chun saw another group coming from the east. We were about to be surrounded, and we were. Trapped in a building with no easy escape route, Mr. Rodriguez came back inside and reported that there were at least 20 armed people surrounding the building. He'd recognized some of them as Marcus's people, but others were from different groups. The restoration of water pressure had gotten everyone's attention, and they were all converging on the pumping station to claim control of it. I realized that we'd made a tactical error. We'd assumed that controlling the pumping station would give us leverage, but we'd also painted a target on our backs that was visible from miles away. Every survivor group in the area knew where we were, knew what we were doing, and knew that we were vulnerable. We'd succeeded in our technical mission, but we'd also trapped ourselves in a building that was about to become a battlefield. The first shots were fired at 4 in the morning. I don't know which group started shooting, but once the violence began, it spread quickly. The sound of gunfire echoed through the building, and I could hear bullets hitting the concrete walls. Mrs. Chun and Sarah took cover behind the control panels while Mr. Rodriguez and I tried to figure out how to defend a building that wasn't designed for defense. The pumping station had thick concrete walls and small windows, which made it hard for attackers to get inside. But it also made it hard for us to get out. We had food and water for maybe 2 days, and ammunition for Mr. Rodriguez's rifle for maybe an hour of sustained fighting. If the siege lasted longer than that, we'd be forced to surrender or die trying to break out. I spent the next few hours trying to understand the tactical situation outside. The different survivor groups weren't just fighting us, they were fighting each other. Marcus's people were trying to take control of the building, but they were also dealing with attacks from other groups that wanted the same thing. The pumping station had become the center of a 3-way battle for control of the neighborhood's water supply. The fighting continued throughout the day, with different groups alternating between attacking the building and attacking each other. I could hear the sound of combat moving around the area, and I could see muzzle flashes from the windows. The battle was destroying the neighborhood, but it was also keeping our attackers from organizing a coordinated assault on the pumping station. By afternoon, I realized that we had an opportunity. The fighting had damaged some of the water distribution pipes, and the system was losing pressure. If I could get outside and make the necessary repairs, we could restore full water pressure to the neighborhood. That would make us valuable to everyone, including the people who were trying to kill us. I explained my plan to the others, and they thought I was crazy. Going outside in the middle of a firefight was suicide, they said. But I knew that staying inside was also suicide. We were running out of food and ammunition, and sooner or later, one of the groups outside would find a way to get inside the building. We needed to change the game, and the only way to do that was to take risks. I left the pumping station through a service tunnel that connected to the main distribution system. The tunnel was narrow and partially flooded, but it allowed me to move unseen through the battlefield above. I could hear the fighting going on over my head, and I could feel the building shake when explosions went off nearby. The damaged pipes were worse than I'd expected. Bullets had torn through the main distribution lines, and water was pouring out onto the frozen ground. The repairs would take hours, and I'd have to work in the open where any sniper could pick me off. But I also knew that if I didn't make the repairs, the water pressure would drop to nothing and our bargaining position would disappear. I spent the rest of the day crawling through the tunnel system, making repairs to the damaged pipes. It was dangerous work, both from the fighting above and from the risk of the tunnels collapsing. But I was in my element, working with systems. I understood solving problems that had clear solutions. For the first time in days, I felt like I was in control of the situation. By evening, I'd restored water pressure to most of the neighborhood. The fighting above ground had died down, partly from exhaustion and partly because the different groups were starting to realize that they needed someone who could maintain the water system. Dead plumbers couldn't fix broken pipes, and broken pipes meant no water for anyone. Marcus was the first to approach the pumping station with a white flag. He wanted to negotiate, he said. He was willing to recognize our control of the water system in exchange for guaranteed access for his people. It was a reasonable offer, but I knew it was also a trap. Marcus didn't negotiate from weakness, and he wouldn't be making offers unless he had an advantage I couldn't see. I was right to be suspicious. While Marcus was talking to us through the front door, his people were cutting through the fence around the electrical substation that powered the pumping station. If they could cut the power, the pumps would stop running and we'd lose our only advantage. It was a smart move, but I'd anticipated it. Every system needs redundancy, and I'd made sure the pumping station had backup power that Marcus didn't know about. When his people cut the main electrical lines, the diesel generators automatically took over. The pumps kept running, the water pressure stayed stable, and Marcus's tactical advantage disappeared. That's when the real negotiations began. Marcus realized that he couldn't simply take the pumping station by force, and the other groups realized that they needed to work with us if they wanted reliable water access. I found myself in the position of mediating between different factions, each with their own demands and their own threats. The negotiations lasted through the night, with different groups taking turns to present their terms. Marcus wanted control of the water distribution in exchange for protection. The group from the east wanted exclusive access to the industrial district's water supply. The group from the south wanted guarantees that their territory wouldn't be cut off if they didn't pay tribute. I listened to all of them, but I was also planning my next move. The pumping station had given us leverage, but it had also made us a target. We couldn't hold the building indefinitely, and we couldn't trust any of the groups that were making promises. We needed a way to maintain our advantage while reducing our vulnerability. That's when I remembered something I'd learned during my confined space training. When you're working in a dangerous environment, you always need an escape route. You never go into a space that you can't get out of, and you never put yourself in a position where someone else can trap you. The pumping station was a trap, and we needed to get out of it without losing our leverage. I made a decision that surprised everyone, including my own people. I announced that we were willing to share control of the water system with all the survivor groups, but only if they could work together to maintain and protect it. No single group would control the water supply, but every group would have access to it as long as they contributed to its maintenance and security. The proposal was radical, but it was also practical. None of the individual groups had the technical expertise to maintain the water system on their own. None of them had enough people to defend the pumping station against all the others. But if they worked together, they could create a stable water supply that would benefit everyone in the neighborhood. The negotiations continued for another day, with each group trying to figure out how to maintain their independence while participating in a cooperative venture. It was complicated, and there were moments when I thought the whole thing would collapse into violence. But desperation has a way of making people reasonable, and everyone needed water more than they needed to dominate their neighbors. By the end of the 30th day, we had an agreement. The pumping station would be managed by a council that included representatives from all the major survivor groups. I would serve as the technical supervisor, responsible for maintaining the equipment and training others. To help with repairs, Mrs. Chun would handle medical emergencies for the entire community. Mr. Rodriguez would coordinate security, and Sarah would manage the distribution of supplies. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was workable. More importantly, it got us out of the pumping station without losing our influence in the community. We'd turned a tactical disaster into a strategic victory, and we'd established ourselves as essential members of the new social order that was emerging from the chaos. But I knew that the agreement was only as strong as the fear that held it together. The different groups were cooperating because they were afraid of losing access to water, not because they trusted each other. If that fear disappeared, or if someone found a way to break the water system, the fragile peace would collapse and we'd be back to fighting for survival. The underground war wasn't over. It was just entering a new phase, one where politics and diplomacy would be as important as technical expertise and military tactics. I'd learned to be a plumber, a negotiator, and a survivor. Now I was about to learn to be a leader in a world where leadership could get you killed. The agreement we'd reached at the pumping station lasted exactly 6 days. That should have been long enough for everyone to see the benefits of cooperation. But desperation makes people paranoid, and paranoia makes them do stupid things. By the 36th day, the fragile alliance was starting to crack, and I could see the signs of the coming storm. It started with small things. Marcus's people were taking more than their agreed share of water during their scheduled access times. The group from the east was accusing the southern group of stealing medical supplies from the shared stockpile. Someone was sabotaging the distribution pipes in areas controlled by rival factions, causing pressure drops and forcing me to make emergency repairs in dangerous territory. I was spending more time mediating disputes than maintaining equipment. And that worried me. The water system was holding together for now, but it needed constant attention. Pipes were freezing and bursting every night. Valves were seizing up from the cold, and the pumps needed daily maintenance to keep running. If I couldn't focus on the technical work, the whole system would fail, and when it failed, the alliance would collapse. Mrs. Chun was dealing with her own problems. Medical supplies were running low, and she was treating more and more injuries from fights between the different factions. Broken bones from tunnel collapses, knife wounds from arguments, oversupplies, frostbite from people who were forced to work outside without proper protection. She was trying to remain neutral, treating everyone equally, but neutrality was becoming a luxury we couldn't afford. Mr. Rodriguez was the first to see the bigger picture. He'd been monitoring radio communications between the different groups, and he'd discovered that they were planning against each other. Marcus was organizing a coalition to take complete control of the water system. The eastern group was stockpiling weapons for a preemptive strike. The southern group was in secret negotiations with survivors from outside our neighborhood, trying to bring in reinforcements. The council meetings became exercises in mutual suspicion and barely concealed hostility. Each group would arrive with more armed guards than the week before. Each representative would make accusations against their rivals, demanding investigations and punishments that I couldn't deliver. Each faction was convinced that the others were cheating, and they were probably right. I realized that our position was becoming untenable. We'd created a system that depended on trust and cooperation, but we were dealing with people who couldn't afford to trust anyone. The Water Council wasn't a government, it was a temporary ceasefire, and ceasefires don't last when people are starving and desperate. That's when I started working on what I called my nuclear option. It was something I'd been thinking about since the first day at the pumping station, but I'd hoped I wouldn't need to use it. If I could control the water supply completely, if I could turn it on and off at will for each section of the neighborhood, I could force cooperation instead of hoping for it. The plan required me to install remote shut-off valves at key points in the distribution system. I'd need to access the main pipes under each faction's territory, install the control equipment, and connect everything to a central control system that only I could operate. It was technically feasible, but it was also incredibly dangerous. I'd have to work alone in hostile territory, and if any of the factions discovered what I was doing, they'd probably kill me. I didn't tell the others about the nuclear option, not even Mrs. Chun. The fewer people who knew about it, the better. Instead, I told them I was doing routine maintenance on the distribution system, checking for winter damage and making preventive repairs. It was technically true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The work took me 2 weeks, and it was the most dangerous 2 weeks of my life up to that point. I was crawling through flooded tunnels in sub-zero temperatures, working with equipment that could electrocute me if I made a mistake, and doing it all while trying to avoid the armed patrols that each faction was running through their territory. On the 41st day, I nearly got caught by Marcus's people while installing a shut-off valve under their headquarters. I was working in a storm drain that ran directly under their building, and I could hear them talking about their plans for taking control of the Water Council. They were going to eliminate the other factions one by one, starting with the weakest group and working their way up. They had enough weapons and people to pull it off, and they were planning to make their move within the next week. I finished the installation and got out of there, but I knew I was running out of time. The Alliance was about to collapse into open warfare, and when it did, we'd be caught in the middle. Mrs. Chun, Mr. Rodriguez, Sarah, and I weren't affiliated with any of the major factions, which made us valuable as neutral mediators but also vulnerable as targets. Everyone would want to eliminate us to prevent us from helping their enemies. The 43rd day brought the crisis I'd been expecting. Someone had poisoned the water supply in the eastern sector, and 3 people had died before Mrs. Chun could figure out what was happening. The eastern group immediately accused Marcus's faction, pointing out that they had the most to gain from eliminating rivals. Marcus's people denied it and suggested that the eastern group had poisoned their own water to justify an attack. The accusations flew back and forth during an emergency council meeting, with each faction demanding justice and threatening retaliation. I tried to calm the situation by focusing on the technical aspects of the problem, explaining how we could test the water and trace the source of the contamination. But nobody was interested in facts. They wanted someone to blame, and they wanted blood. The meeting ended with the Eastern group withdrawing from the Alliance and declaring war on Marcus's faction. The Southern group tried to remain neutral, but neutrality was impossible when bullets were flying overhead. By the end of the day, we had 3 separate wars going on in our neighborhood, with each faction trying to capture or destroy the infrastructure that the others depended on. I made the decision to activate my nuclear option. That night, I went to the central control system I'd installed in an abandoned building near the pumping station. The system was connected to shut-off valves throughout the distribution network, and I could control water flow to each faction's territory independently. It was the ultimate leverage, the ability to decide who lived and who died by controlling access to water. I started by cutting off water to all 3 factions simultaneously. Within 6 hours, their representatives were banging on my door, demanding explanations and threatening violence. I told them that the water system had been damaged in the fighting, and that I needed guarantees of safety before I could make repairs. It was a lie, but it was a believable lie. The negotiations lasted 3 days, with each faction trying to figure out how to get their water restored without giving their enemies the same advantage. I played them against each other, offering to restore water to whichever group was willing to make the biggest concessions. It was manipulation, pure and simple, but it was also the only way to prevent a war that would destroy everything we'd built. Marcus was the first to crack. His people were getting desperate without water, and some of them were talking about switching sides. He came to me privately and offered to recognize our complete independence from all factions in exchange for guaranteed water access. It was a good offer, but I knew it was also meaningless. Marcus's promises weren't worth the breath he used to make them. The Eastern group tried a different approach. They attempted to capture Mrs. Chun, figuring that they could force me to cooperate by threatening someone I cared about. They didn't realize that she'd been expecting something like this, and that Mr. Rodriguez had been teaching her basic self-defense techniques. The kidnapping attempt failed, but it showed me how far the different factions were willing to go. That's when I decided to end the games and establish new rules. I called a meeting of all faction leaders and told them exactly what I'd done. I had complete control of the water system, and I was willing to use it. Anyone who threatened my people or tried to take control of the infrastructure would find their water cut off permanently. Anyone who cooperated would have reliable access to clean water. The revelation changed everything. Suddenly, the faction leaders realized that all their military planning and political maneuvering meant nothing if they couldn't get water. I wasn't just the technical supervisor anymore. I was the most powerful person in the neighborhood, and everyone knew it. Marcus tried to call my bluff, claiming that I wouldn't really cut off water to innocent people just to make a political point. I proved him wrong by shutting off water to his entire territory for 24 hours. By the end of that day, his own people were ready to lynch him, and he was begging me to restore service. The new system I established was simple and brutal. Each faction would get water access based on their contribution to community security and maintenance. Groups that caused trouble would lose access. Groups that helped maintain the infrastructure would get priority treatment. I became the judge, jury, and executioner for water rights in our neighborhood. It wasn't a democracy, and it wasn't fair in any traditional sense. But it was stable, and stability was more valuable than fairness when people were dying from thirst and cold. The fighting stopped. The infrastructure sabotage ended, and people started working together because they had no choice. But I knew that my control was based on fear, and fear-based systems are inherently unstable. If anyone found a way to bypass my shut-off valves, or if they discovered an alternative water source, my power would disappear overnight. I needed to build something more sustainable, something that would last longer than my ability to intimidate people. That's when I started working on the most ambitious project yet. Instead of just controlling the existing water system, I would expand it. I would connect our neighborhood to other survivor communities, creating a regional network that would benefit everyone. The project would require cooperation between former enemies, but it would also make everyone dependent on the expanded system. The plan was technically complex and politically dangerous. I'd need to send teams into hostile territory to install new pipes and pumping stations. I'd need to negotiate with survivor groups that had no reason to trust us. I'd need to build infrastructure that could survive attacks and sabotage attempts. But I had advantages that other people didn't. I understood the city's underground systems better than anyone else in the area. I had a team of people who trusted me and were willing to take risks for the greater good. Most importantly, I had the nuclear option, the ability to cut off water to anyone who tried to stop the expansion project. The work began on the 52nd day, with small teams venturing into the tunnels beyond our neighborhood. We were looking for other survivor communities, mapping their locations and assessing their needs. We found more people than I'd expected, scattered groups of families and individuals who were barely surviving in hidden shelters and abandoned buildings. Some of these groups were friendly and eager to join our network. Others were hostile and suspicious of our motives. A few were so desperate that they attacked us on sight, trying to steal our equipment and supplies. Each encounter taught us something about the new world we were living in, and each lesson made us more cautious about who we trusted. The expansion project attracted attention from outside our immediate area. We started encountering scouts and messengers from larger survivor organizations, groups that controlled entire sections of the city. Some of them were interested in trade and cooperation. Others saw us as a threat to their territory and resources. One group in particular caught my attention. They called themselves the Detroit Recovery Coalition, and they claimed to be working toward rebuilding city services and establishing a new government. They had doctors, engineers, former city officials, and military personnel. They sounded like exactly the kind of organization we should be working with. But Mr. Rodriguez was suspicious of them, and his instincts had kept us alive so far. He'd noticed that the coalition scouts were asking very specific questions about our water system, questions that suggested they were planning to take it over rather than cooperate with us. He'd also heard rumors that the coalition was forcing smaller groups to join them, using military tactics to expand their territory. I decided to meet with the coalition representatives, but I also made sure that our nuclear option was ready to use if the meeting went bad. If they tried to take our system by force, they'd discover that controlling the pumping station wasn't enough. Without access to my shut-off valves, they'd have water pressure, but no way to control where it went. The meeting was scheduled for the 55th day at a neutral location halfway between our territory and theirs. I would bring Mrs. Chun and Sarah as advisors, while Mr. Rodriguez stayed behind to coordinate our defenses. It was risky, but it was also an opportunity to establish relationships with a larger organization. I had no way of knowing that the meeting would turn into a trap, or that the coalition had already decided to eliminate us as a potential threat. I thought I was going to a negotiation, but I was actually walking into the beginning of the siege that would test everything we'd built and everything we'd learned about survival in the new world. The Detroit Recovery Coalition had impressive credentials and reasonable-sounding proposals, but they also had tanks and trained soldiers. They were about to teach me that in the post-apocalyptic world, the biggest threat isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes the people who sound the most civilized are the most dangerous of all. The meeting with the Detroit Recovery Coalition was supposed to take place at an abandoned school building that sat roughly halfway between our territory and theirs. I should have realized it was a trap when their representative suggested the location. The school was isolated, surrounded by open ground, and had multiple exits that could be blocked easily. It was perfect for an ambush, but I was thinking like a negotiator instead of a soldier. Mrs. Chun, Sarah, and I arrived at the school at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on the 55th day. The coalition representatives were already there, 3 people in clean clothes and winter gear that looked suspiciously new. They introduced themselves as Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a former city health director, Captain James Mitchell, a retired Army engineer, and Miss Patricia Cole, who claimed to be coordinating refugee services for the coalition. They had impressive credentials and spoke intelligently about infrastructure, public health, and community organization. Dr. Warren understood the challenges of maintaining water quality in damaged systems. Captain Mitchell knew about the technical requirements for rebuilding electrical grids. Ms. Cole had detailed plans for distributing food and medical supplies to survivor communities throughout the city. Everything they said made sense, and their proposals seemed reasonable. They wanted to integrate our water system into a larger network that would serve the entire metropolitan area. They had resources we needed, including fuel for the pumping stations, spare parts for the equipment, and medical supplies for Mrs. Chun's work. They even offered to help us locate and rescue survivors from other parts of the city, including my daughters Emma and Sophia in Ann Arbor. But there was something wrong with the whole situation. Something that made my instincts scream danger even while my rational mind was impressed by their presentation. It was the way Captain Mitchell's eyes kept moving to the exits, the way Dr. Warren asked very specific questions about our defensive capabilities, the way Ms. Cole seemed more interested in the location of our supply caches than in coordinating refugee services. The meeting had been going for about an hour when I heard the sound that confirmed my suspicions. It was faint, barely audible over the wind, but I'd heard it often enough during the tunnel wars to recognize it immediately. Boots on concrete, multiple people moving in formation, trying to be quiet, but not quite succeeding. We were surrounded. I caught Mrs. Chun's eye and nodded toward the door we'd come through. She understood immediately and started gathering her things, making it look casual. Sarah was harder to signal without being obvious, but she noticed that Mrs. Chun was preparing to leave and started doing the same. The coalition representatives continued talking, but I could see the tension in their postures. They were waiting for something. That's when Captain Mitchell made his mistake. He glanced at his watch and then looked toward the windows facing east. It was a quick look, barely a second, but it told me everything I needed to know. He was checking the time because something was supposed to happen at a specific moment, and he was looking east because that's where his backup was positioned. I stood up and told the coalition representatives that we needed to discuss their proposals with our council before making any commitments. It was a reasonable thing to say, and it would give us an excuse to leave. But Dr. Warren's response confirmed that leaving wasn't an option. She said that we needed to reach an agreement today, that the coalition couldn't wait for bureaucratic processes when people were dying. The way she said it wasn't a request or even a strong suggestion. It was an ultimatum delivered with a smile, the kind of threat that people make when they know you can't refuse. She was telling me that we weren't leaving that building until we agreed to join the coalition on their terms. I asked what would happen if we decided not to join, and Captain Mitchell answered with military directness. He said that independent groups were a threat to regional stability, that they competed for resources and created conflicts that hurt everyone. The coalition had a responsibility to prevent that kind of disruption, even if it meant using force to protect the greater good. That's when I understood the real situation. The coalition wasn't interested in cooperation or negotiation. They were expanding their territory by absorbing smaller groups, and they'd decided that our water system was too valuable to leave in independent hands. The meeting was just a formality, a chance to get us to surrender voluntarily before they took what they wanted by force. I told them that we needed a few minutes to discuss their offer privately, and I led Mrs. Chun and Sarah to the far end of the room. While we were walking, I whispered instructions about what we were going to do. The school had a basement with maintenance tunnels that connected to the storm drain system. If we could get down there, we could escape through the tunnels and make it back to our territory. The basement access was through a door near the kitchen, and we'd have to move fast to reach it before the coalition people could stop us. Mrs. Chun was worried about the armed personnel that Captain Mitchell had positioned around the building. But I knew that our best chance was to get underground where their numbers wouldn't matter as much. We made our move during what should have been a routine bathroom break. Sarah created a distraction by asking detailed questions about the coalition's medical facilities while Mrs. Chen and I slipped out of the main room. We found the basement stairs and were halfway down when we heard shouting from above. The coalition representatives had figured out what we were doing. The basement was dark and filled with old school equipment, but I brought a flashlight and I knew what to look for. The maintenance tunnels were behind a utility door that was locked, but my multi-tool made short work of the cheap padlock. We were through the door and into the tunnel system when the first coalition soldiers reached the basement. The tunnels under the school were older and smaller than the ones I was used to, but they connected to the storm drains that ran throughout the city. I knew these systems well enough to navigate by feel and sound, and I was confident that we could make it back to our territory if we moved quickly and quietly. But the coalition had anticipated that we might try to escape through the tunnels. We'd only been moving for about 10 minutes when we encountered the first pursuit team. They had flashlights and radios, and they were organized enough to coordinate their search pattern. We had to change direction 3 times to avoid them, and each detour took us further from our destination. Mrs. Chen was struggling with the physical demands of crawling through narrow passages, and Sarah was having trouble with the claustrophobic conditions. I was pushing them as hard as I could, but I knew that the coalition teams were gaining on us. They had more people, better equipment, and they knew we were down there. That's when I made the decision to split up. I would continue toward our territory and get help, while Mrs. Chun and Sarah would hide in a maintenance chamber until the pursuit teams had passed. It was risky, but it was better than all of us getting captured together. If I could make it back to Mr. Rodriguez, we could organize a rescue operation. I left them with my emergency radio and instructions to call for help if they got into trouble. Then I took off through the tunnels, moving as fast as I could without making noise. I knew that the coalition would be monitoring radio frequencies, so any communication would give away our position. But it was better than having no way to coordinate. It took me 6 hours to make it back to our neighborhood, and when I got there, I found that the coalition had already made their move. They'd surrounded our territory with armed vehicles and were demanding that we surrender the water system. Mr. Rodriguez had activated our defensive positions, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. The coalition had brought tanks, armored personnel, carriers, and trained soldiers with military-grade weapons. They had radio jamming equipment that was blocking our communications, and they'd cut the power lines that supplied electricity to our pumping station. They weren't interested in negotiation or compromise. They wanted complete surrender, and they were prepared to use overwhelming force to get it. Mr. Rodriguez had gathered the leaders from the other survivor factions, and they were all looking to me for guidance. Marcus, the representatives from the eastern and southern groups, even some of the smaller communities that had joined our water network. They were scared, and they had every right to be. The coalition had enough firepower to level our entire neighborhood if we refused to cooperate. But I had something that the coalition didn't know about, something that could change the balance of power in our favor. My nuclear option wasn't just about controlling water flow to our immediate area. I'd expanded the system during the network project, and I now had shut-off valves installed throughout a much larger region. If the coalition wanted to control our water system, they'd discover that the system was much bigger and more complex than they'd realized. I explained the situation to the faction leaders and gave them a choice. We could surrender and hope that the coalition would treat us fairly, or we could fight using the only weapon that might be effective against their military superiority. If we cut off water to the entire metropolitan area, including the coalition's own territory, we could force them to negotiate instead of simply taking what they wanted. It was a dangerous gamble. The coalition might decide to destroy our infrastructure, rather than negotiate, which would leave everyone without water. They might also decide to eliminate us entirely, figuring that dead enemies couldn't threaten their supply lines. But surrender was also dangerous, because there was no guarantee that they'd honor any agreements they made. Marcus was the first to support the plan, probably because he'd been on the receiving end of my water control tactics and knew how effective they could be. The other faction leaders agreed, partly because they trusted my judgment and partly because they couldn't think of any better alternatives. We were committed to a strategy that would either save us or get us all killed. I activated the nuclear option at 10 o'clock that night. Every shut-off valve in the expanded network closed simultaneously, cutting off water flow to approximately 40 square miles of metropolitan Detroit. The coalition's own headquarters lost water pressure within minutes, and their field commanders started receiving reports of system failures throughout their territory. The coalition's response was swift and predictable. They demanded that I restore water service immediately, threatening to destroy the pumping station if I refused. I told them that the pumping station was just one part of a much larger system, and that destroying it would leave everyone without water permanently. If they wanted reliable service, they'd have to negotiate. The negotiations lasted for 3 days, with both sides trying to find a solution that would give them acceptable security without completely destroying their opponents. The coalition needed water for their own people, but they also needed to maintain their reputation for decisive action. We needed to maintain our independence, but we also needed to avoid a military confrontation that we couldn't win. Dr. Warren turned out to be the most reasonable of the coalition leadership, probably because she understood the public health implications of a complete water system failure. She proposed a compromise that would give the coalition oversight of the regional water network while leaving day-to-day operations under local control. It wasn't perfect, but it was workable. The agreement we finally reached established a new regional authority for critical infrastructure, with representatives from all the major survivor communities. The coalition would provide security and resources for major projects, while local groups would maintain operational control of their systems. I would serve as the chief technical officer for the entire network, with authority to make emergency decisions about water distribution. It was a complex arrangement, but it solved the immediate crisis and established a framework for future cooperation. More importantly, it got Mrs. Chun and Sarah released from coalition custody. They'd been captured during their attempt to hide in the maintenance chamber, but they'd been treated well and were unharmed. The new system wasn't perfect, and it required constant negotiation between groups that didn't trust each other. But it was stable, and it provided essential services to a much larger population than any single community could support. We'd gone from a neighborhood survival group to a regional infrastructure authority in less than 3 months. The most important result of the agreement was that it gave me access to coalition resources for searching for survivors in other parts of the metropolitan area. Within 2 weeks of the treaty signing, I was leading a rescue mission to Ann Arbor, finally able to look for Emma and Sophia after more than 2 months of separation. We found them alive and relatively healthy in a refugee camp that the University of Michigan had established in their basketball arena. They'd lost weight and they were traumatized by everything they'd experienced, but they were survivors just like their father. The reunion was the happiest moment I'd had since the Ice Age began, and it reminded me why all the fighting and negotiating had been worthwhile. The expanded water network became the foundation for rebuilding civilization in southeastern Michigan. Other infrastructure projects followed, including electrical generation, food distribution, and medical services. The survivor communities that had been fighting each other for resources started working together to rebuild what they'd lost. I realized that my experience as a plumber had given me more than technical skills. It had taught me to think systemically, to understand how complex networks function and fail. Those lessons applied to social systems just as much as mechanical ones, and they'd helped me navigate the political challenges of the post-apocalyptic world. The Ice Age wasn't over, and it wouldn't be over for years to come. But we'd proven that human beings could adapt to even the most extreme circumstances if they were willing to work together and think creatively about solutions. The skills that had seemed ordinary in the old world had become extraordinary in the new one. My daughters and I moved into a house near the central pumping station, where I could manage the network operations and still have a normal family life. Emma and Sophia started school again in one of the coalition's educational programs, and they began making friends with other children who'd survived the catastrophe. The neighborhood that had been a battlefield became a thriving community, with workshops, markets, and social centers. The tunnel system that had been a war zone became a transportation network that connected different districts safely and efficiently. The water system that had been a source of conflict became the foundation of a new society. But I never forgot the lessons I'd learned during those first 90 days. Trust was valuable but dangerous. Cooperation was essential but fragile. Technical knowledge was powerful, but only if you were willing to use it decisively. And most importantly, survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about maintaining your humanity while doing whatever was necessary to protect the people you cared about. The Detroit Recovery Coalition eventually evolved into a new municipal government with elected representatives and democratic institutions. The Regional Water Authority became a model for infrastructure management that other survivor communities adopted. The networks we built during the crisis became the foundation for a new kind of civilization, one that was more resilient and more collaborative than what had come before. I served as the Director of Public Works for the new Detroit government, overseeing not just water systems, but all the infrastructure that kept the city running. It was a job that combined technical expertise with political leadership, and it was exactly the kind of challenge I'd been training for my entire life without knowing it. The Ice Age changed everything about how human beings lived on Earth, but it also revealed capabilities that had been hidden during the easy times. When the old world ended, we discovered that we were stronger, more creative, and more adaptable than we'd ever imagined. The plumber who'd started by fixing water heaters had ended up helping to rebuild civilization itself.